I found the signature page on a Tuesday morning, half buried in the recycling bin outside my home office. The ink was still wet enough to smudge when I touched it, and the notary seal bore yesterday's date. My son had forged my name on a preliminary sales agreement for TechFlow Solutions, the software licensing firm I had built from a laptop in a legal pad 12 years ago. I did not call him immediately. I photographed the document from 4 angles under natural light, uploaded the images to my secure cloud storage, and made a pot of coffee. The house was quiet. My son had moved back in 8 months earlier after his third startup collapsed, and he was still asleep at 10 in the morning. I sat at my desk and read the agreement twice, noting every clause, every addendum, every place where his inexperience showed through the glossy language some attorney had dressed it up in. The buyer was offering $4 million. My son would have walked away with nothing. He had no equity, no authority, and no idea what the company was actually worth. I set the document aside and opened my filing cabinet. People used to laugh at my habits. My ex-wife called me obsessive. My son, louder and less kind, had taken to calling me paranoid. He would stand in the doorway of my office and watch me organize contracts into labeled binders, chronological and cross-referenced, each page in its archival sleeve. He would shake his head, sometimes smile like he pitied me, and say things like, "Dad, everything's digital now. You know that, right?" Or, "Nobody reads that stuff anyway." Once, when he was helping me move file boxes into the new house after the divorce, he asked me why I even bothered. I told him I bothered because words on paper were the only things that kept their shape when people changed theirs. He did not ask again. I was 42, though most people guessed older until they looked closely. I kept my posture straight and my hair trimmed short, more gray than brown now, and I did not waste motion. I had started 3 companies in 15 years. 2 had been modest successes, enough to sell for reasonable returns and fund the next idea. TechFlow was different. It was profitable, stable, and built on relationships I had spent a decade cultivating with mid-sized manufacturers who needed custom workflow software but could not afford enterprise solutions. I owned it entirely. No partners, no investors, no board. Just me and a scattered team of contractors I trusted because I had vetted them personally and kept the agreements clean. My son had watched all of this happen from a distance. He went to college, studied business with the vague confidence of someone who believed momentum was a substitute for strategy, and graduated into a market that did not care about his optimism. He tried to launch a meal kit startup that burned through his savings in 4 months. Then, a dropshipping venture that lasted 6 weeks. Then, a consulting firm that never signed a single client. Each time he came back a little angrier, a little more certain that the world was rigged and that people like me, people who succeeded, had gotten lucky or cut corners he was too principled to cut. When he asked to move in, I agreed without hesitation. He was my son. But I also made it clear that he would contribute. I gave him a role at TechFlow, nothing senior, nothing he had not earned. Customer onboarding coordinator, 40 hours a week, salary, benefits, the same offer I gave anyone competent enough to answer emails on time. He took it because he had no alternative, and for a while, he did the work. Not brilliantly, but adequately. I thought stability might teach him something about patience. Instead, it taught him resentment. I began noticing small things. A sharpness in his tone when I asked him to revise a client proposal. The way he would close his laptop when I entered the room, too quickly, like I was interrupting something private. Twice, I found printed copies of company financial statements in the trash, documents he had no clearance to access. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said he was trying to understand the business better, trying to see where we could grow. I let it pass. I wanted to believe him. Then came the morning he brought a guest to the house unannounced. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard 2 voices in the hallway. My son's and another, older, smooth in the way consultants and salespeople train themselves to sound. I walked to the doorway and saw them standing by the coat rack. The other man wore a gray suit that fit too well, and he extended his hand before I could ask who he was. He introduced himself as a business development associate with an acquisition firm based in Chicago. He said my son had reached out about exploring options for TechFlow, and he was in town to discuss a preliminary valuation. He smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that assumed cooperation. I looked at my son. He did not meet my eyes. I thanked the associate for coming, told him there had been a miscommunication, and walked him to the door. He left his card on the hall table, and I heard his car pull away before I turned back to my son. "What was that?" I asked. "An opportunity," he said. "You're leaving money on the table, Dad. This company could be worth 10 times what you think if you just let someone with vision take a look. I didn't authorize you to contact anyone. I'm trying to help. By inviting strangers into my home to discuss my business without my knowledge?" He exhaled, the way people do when they are gathering patience for someone they consider slow. "You're never going to sell. You're going to sit on this thing until it's worthless because you're too scared to let go." "I'm not scared," I said. "I'm careful." He laughed. It was not a kind sound. "Careful. Right. You and your files." I did not argue. I went back to my office and locked the door. That conversation stayed with me, but I did not act on it immediately. I continued working, continued running TechFlow the way I always had, and I watched. My son became quieter over the following weeks, more polite, which made me more wary. Politeness from someone angry is a costume, and I knew he was planning something. I started checking the office more carefully. I enabled alerts on every digital document that touched company records. I reviewed access logs. Nothing appeared out of place, but the feeling persisted. Then I found the signature page in the recycling. I pulled the full contract from my files that afternoon. It was a standard operating agreement I had drafted when I incorporated TechFlow, back when the company was just an idea and 2 early clients. Buried in Section 12, subsection C, was a clause I had written myself after consulting with an attorney I trusted. It stipulated that no transfer of ownership, no sale of assets, no merger or acquisition could proceed without written consent from the original founder, witnessed and notarized with a 30-day waiting period to allow for independent legal review. The clause also required that any attempt to circumvent this provision would result in immediate nullification of the transaction and potential legal penalties for breach of fiduciary duty. I had put that clause in place because I had seen what happened to founders who lost control of their own work. I had watched friends sign agreements in good faith, only to discover that the lawyers on the other side had buried traps in the fine print. I swore I would never be one of them. My son had no idea the clause existed. He had never read the operating agreement. He had never asked to. I made copies of everything. The forged signature page, the sales agreement, the original operating agreement, the access log showing when he had printed financial documents without authorization. I organized them into a binder with tabs and page numbers, the same way I organized everything, and I placed the binder in my safe. Then I went upstairs and knocked on his door. He answered after a long pause, and I could see his laptop open on the bed behind him, the screen angled away. I asked if we could talk. He nodded and followed me downstairs. We sat in the living room, the binder on the coffee table between us. I did not open it yet. I asked him how work was going. He said, "Fine." I asked if he had any concerns about the company, anything he wanted to discuss. He said no. I asked if he'd been in contact with anyone about selling TechFlow. He hesitated. Then he said, "Why?" "Because I found this," I said, and I opened the binder to the signature page. His face did not change much, but I saw his hands tighten on the armrests. He said nothing for a few seconds, and then he tried deflection. He said it was exploratory, just a conversation, nothing binding. He said the buyer was serious and the price was good, and I was being stubborn for no reason. He said he was doing this for both of us, for the family, because I was too stuck in my ways to see the bigger picture. I let him finish. Then I turned to the next tab in the binder and showed him the operating agreement, the section highlighted in yellow. I read the clause aloud, slowly, so he could hear every word. When I finished, I closed the binder and looked at him. "You don't have the authority to sell anything," I said. "You never did. And if you had gone through with this, the buyer's attorneys would have discovered that clause during due diligence, and the deal would have collapsed. You would have looked incompetent, and I would have looked complicit. You would have cost me clients and reputation, and you would have walked away with nothing." He stared at the binder like it had betrayed him. "You set me up." I protected myself, I said. There's a difference. He stood, and I thought for a moment he might yell, but he did not. He left the room, and I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the sound of his door closing. I sat there for a while, the binder still open on the table, and I thought about how much easier it would have been if he had just asked. The next morning, I called my attorney. I explained the situation without emotion, and I asked what steps I should take to protect the company and myself. She recommended formally revoking any access my son had to company records, updating security protocols, and documenting everything in case he tried again. She also suggested I consider whether I wanted to pursue legal action for the forgery. I told her I would think about it. I spent the rest of that day reviewing every contract I had ever signed, every partnership agreement, every vendor relationship. I checked for vulnerabilities, places where someone with access and ambition could cause damage. I found 2 minor gaps, outdated clauses that needed tightening, and I scheduled revisions with my attorney for the following week. It was tedious work, the kind of work my son would have called pointless, but it gave me clarity. Paperwork was not about paranoia, it was about knowing exactly where you stood when someone tried to move the ground beneath you. My son avoided me for 3 days. He stayed in his room, left early for work, came back late. When we passed in the hallway, he did not speak. I did not force conversation. I knew he was deciding something, and I wanted to see what choice he made. On the 4th day, he came to my office. He knocked, which he rarely did, and when I told him to come in, he stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. He looked younger than he had in months, less sure. "I talked to that buyer," he said. "Told them the deal was off." I nodded. They asked why. I told them I didn't have authority. "Good." He shifted his weight. "They said I should have checked the paperwork first." They were right. He looked at the filing cabinet behind me, the rows of binders, the labeled folders. "You really keep all of that?" "Every page." "Why?" "Because people forget," I said. "Or they remember wrong. Or they decide the agreement meant something different than what we wrote down. Paper doesn't change. It just sits there and tells you what you agreed to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Did you ever think I'd actually pull it off, the sale?" "No," I said, "but I thought you'd try. That's why you put that clause in, years ago, before I was even involved. I put it in because I've seen what happens when you don't." He nodded slowly, and I could see him working through it, the realization that the boring details he had dismissed were the only reason the company still existed. He did not apologize. I did not expect him to. But something in his posture softened, and when he left, he closed the door quietly instead of letting it slam. Over the next few weeks, I noticed changes, small ones. He started asking questions about contracts when clients signed on, questions about terms and liability and how we structured payment schedules. He asked if he could sit in on a negotiation call, and I let him listen. Afterward, he said he had not realized how much of the work happened before anyone shook hands. I told him that was the point. The handshake was the easy part. I did not give him access to sensitive documents again. That trust would take time if it came back at all. But I showed him where the files were kept, how they were organized, and why each section mattered. He took notes. I did not ask him to. He just did. One evening, a few months later, I was working late when he knocked on my office door. He had a folder in his hand, and he asked if I had a minute. I told him to sit. He opened the folder and showed me a draft contract for a new client he had been courting, a small manufacturer looking for inventory tracking software. The terms were reasonable, the language clear, and he had included a clause about dispute resolution that I would have written myself. "I wanted you to check it before I sent it," he said. I read it carefully, made 2 small notes in the margin, and handed it back. "It's good work." He looked at the notes, nodded, and stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "Thanks." "For what?" "For not letting me screw it up." I did not say anything. He left, and I went back to my files. Months passed, and the company continued. My son stayed on, no longer as a favor, but as someone who contributed. He started keeping his own files, organized the way I had shown him, and when clients asked him questions, he answered with the same precision I used. He was learning slowly that the work was not about vision or momentum or luck. It was about knowing what you built and how to protect it. One afternoon, I was cleaning out an old storage box when I found a photograph from years earlier, back when my son was in middle school. We were standing in front of my first office, a converted garage with a peeling sign and a folding table for a desk. He was holding a stack of papers Ida had asked him to carry inside, and he was smiling, proud to be helping. I had forgotten that version of him, the one who thought paperwork was important because I said it was. I kept the photograph. I put it in a frame on my desk, next to the binder with the operating agreement, and I left it there. People still ask me why I keep so many files, why I spend hours reviewing contracts that most people would skim or delegate. I tell them the same thing I told my son. Words on paper are the only things that keep their shape when people change theirs. They are the difference between what someone says they meant and what they actually agreed to. They are the proof that you were careful when it mattered. My son understands that now. He understands it because he tried to take something that was not his, and the paperwork stopped him. He learned the lesson not from a lecture, but from experience, from the quiet, immovable fact that I had built protections into the foundation of everything I made. He does not mock the files anymore. He adds to them. And when he asks me now why I keep everything, I do not need to answer. He already knows.